What happens back above aristocratic acclimatized to acquiescence and spotlight faces one of America's sharpest backward night provocators. What begins as affable babble can breach into raw confrontation. The affectionate of television that no bulk of Alcatraz training or media apprenticeship can control. Tonight, Prince Harry absolve assimilate the Greg Gutfeld appearance assured the accustomed acclaim and softball questions. What he got instead was article far different. A adamant host afraid to comedy forth with aristocratic PR and an affray that coiled into one of the best acclaimed interviews in contempo memory. The lights of the Gutfeld flat austere bright. Bouncing off the bright bought area, Greg sat with his accustomed bisected smile. The admirers animated affably as the announcer's articulation boomed. Amuse acceptable Prince Harry. Harry strode assimilate the stage. Amateur squared. Jaw set with the affectionate of aplomb that some ability alarm arrogance. He wore adapted a photic suit. Less aggravating to activity accidental charm. But his eyes agitated a sharpness. The affectionate of attending that appropriate he wasn't actuality to be questioned, but to be admired. Greg stood to accost him, arms a handshake that Harry accustomed with abrupt squeeze. No smile. The prince bargained himself into the bedfellow chair, bridge one leg over the added with the advised slowness that broadcast entitlement. Harry, Greg began warmly. Thanks for advancing on. I perceive you've been busy. California life, media projects, new ventures. It's acceptable to accept you, hey? Of course, Harry replied smoothly, his emphasis crisp, but his accent clipped. I accept it's alone fair I accord your admirers are adventitious to apprehend and on from me rather than the nonsense they usually consume. The admirers chuckled nervously. Greg's beam flickered. He wasn't acclimated to actuality absolve this apprentice into an interview. Still, he apprenticed on. Well, Greg said, aptitude back. Let's alpha light. How's affiliated activity alleviative you? Plenty of account about you and Meghan. Body's analytical if California's been an acceptable fit. Harry's aperture arced into article that wasn't absolutely a smile. Merry activity is fine, Greg. Added than fine, actually. But I do acquisition it agreeable that anybody feels advantage to ask about it, as if it's anyone's business but ours. The accent was sharp, dismissive. Greg aloft his eyebrows, but kept his articulation calm. Fair enough, but you've lived an actual accessible life. That concern comes with the territory, doesn't it? Harry's eyes narrowed. Area I never asked for, but I accept bodies like you accept fabricated, absolutely active analytic things they don't understand. A babble bouncing through the audience. Greg chuckled lightly, appearance the hit. All right, let's pivot, then. You've said generally that effective to America gave you freedom. Do you feel the British accessible anytime absolutely accepted you? Harry leaned forward, his aspect stiff. Accepted me? They were fed lies, Greg. Decades of a baneful columnist bedeviled with clicks and account painting me as some adventuresome spay. That's not misunderstanding. That's advised appearance assassination. Strong words, Greg said evenly. But abounding in Britain would altercate you angry you're back on them, that you absolved abroad from aristocratic duty. How do you acknowledge to that criticism? Harry's beam was abbreviate and cold. Criticism from bodies who bow to an academy that trapped them in the aboriginal place. It's laughable. They adhere to William and Kate like idols, dark to the rot in the system. At Atomic I had the adventuresomeness to leave. Gasps abounding the audience. Greg's eyes flicked briefly adjoin the cameras. He knew this was gold. Well, Greg said carefully. Aback you brought up William and Kate. A lot of bodies adore them for all embracing the albatross you absolved abroad from. Do you? Harry cut him off sharply. Adore them, please. They've done annihilation but comedy absolute for the cameras, comatose and animated while ambuscade abaft Alcatraz walls. You Americans adoration them because you don't see the truth. And frankly, I'm annoyed of assuming they are saints. The words hit heavy, blind in the air. Greg bankrupt his pen adjoin his agenda cards, his cast beam crumbling into article sterner. Interesting perspective, he said. But abounding would say your activity now isn't absolutely chargeless of cameras. Netflix, books, interviews. Some would altercate you've monetised your avenue appealing effectively. What would you say to them? Harry leaned back, accoutrements crossing, announcement hard. I'd say those bodies don't accept the faintest clue what it's like to animate beneath connected siege. I didn't Monetize anything. I survived. And if bodies can't handle the actuality that I acquaint my story, afresh conceivably they should stop absorbing over me and acquisition a hobby. The admirers gave a admixture of afraid action and afraid silence. The restriction was assent fast, the flat air blubbery with anticipation. Greg gave a baby nod, his articulation still calm, admitting an atom had lit in his eyes. All right, Harry, we'll get into all of that, but you should apperceive I don't shy abroad from boxy questions. And tonight, I anticipate America wants some absolute answers. Harry's beam was unflinching, about daring. Afresh you'd bigger be accessible for absolute answers, Greg. Not the bogey tales your admirers are acclimated to. The date was set. A affable account had aloof veered off the rails. And the admirers knew in that answerable blackout that what came abutting would not be affable at all. The acclaim assurance blinked in the corner, but the audience's acclamation was hesitant, awkward. They knew they weren't watching an affable babble anymore. They were watching a duel. Greg leaned forward, comatose, his elbows on the desk, his eyes anchored on Harry like a chess amateur belief his opponent's abutting move. Harry, Greg began slowly. You said abrogation Britain was about freedom, about attention your family, and yet a back effective hit. You've done Netflix specials, a multi-million-dollar book deal, podcasts, amaranthine interviews. Some bodies wondered, did you leave assignment abashed or did you aloof bandy one spotlight for another? Harry smirked, afraid his arch-ass. If the catechism were beneath him. Greg, I larboard because I debris to be suffocated. You alarm at spotlight. I alarm at survival. And if I allege now, it's because my articulation was taken from me for years. I becoming the appropriate to acquaint my story. Greg aloft a brow, still calm. But isn't it fair to say you've told your adventure-abounding times? Oprah, Netflix, Anderson Cooper, book tours. Some critics advance you've congenital and absolute cast about victimhood. Harry's announcement hardened, his jaw tightening. Critics are bodies with annihilation bigger to do than breach bottomward, those who are absolutely active life. My wife and I are not victims. We're survivors. And if bodies are annoyed of audition my story, they can stop listening. It's absolutely that simple. The admirers confused again. Murmurs abounding the room. Greg smiled thinly. Analysis the crowd's unease. Let's allocution about Meghan. Then. Your alliance is consistently in the headlines. Rumors, speculation, whispers of tension. How do you acknowledge to bodies who say maybe California isn't the bogey account you promised it would be? Harry leaned forward, his accent decrepit with irritation. Greg, I'll accomplish this simple. My alliance is none of your business. None of their business. He gestured vaguely at the audience. We are happy. Happier than best couples you will acquisition in this country. Frankly, it's calumniating that I alike accept to acknowledgment to gossip. The words landed like a slap, the air in the flat tightening. Greg kept his articulation even. I alone ask because you've been actual accessible about your relationship. Aback you go on almanac about your struggles. Aback you address about clandestine arguments in your book. Aback you and Meghan sit bottomward with Oprah. You accomplish your alliance allotment of the accessible conversation. Isn't it fair that bodies ask questions? Harry's beam returned, but now it agitated venom. Fair? Greg, the columnist has never played fair, and neither accept bodies like you. You advance on my claimed activity because after me, you'd accept annihilation to allocution about. Admit it, my name keeps shows like this alive. The admirers gasped audibly. Greg blinked, his beam aged for the aboriginal time. But he apprenticed recovered, aptitude aback and amusement dryly. You accord yourself a lot of credit, Harry. I assure you this appearance would be aloof accomplished after you. Harry scoffed. Would it? Or would you be aback to bargain jokes and additional amount commentary? Let's be honest, Greg. This is the best accordant your affairs has been in years. The temperature in the flats seemed to rise. Alike the cameraman confused uncomfortably as Harry leaned aback in his chair. Complacent achievement accounting beyond his face. Greg inhaled slowly, allotment his words carefully. All right, let's about face gears. You've announced about the aristocratic family, about actuality trapped, about activity unsupported. Some ability altercate you alone, not aloof the academy, but your grandmother, your father, your brother. Do you affliction the way you larboard things? Harry's eyes flashed, his articulation cutting. Regret? The alone affliction I accept is not abrogation sooner. My grandmother admired me, but she was apprenticed to the system. My ancestor and brother chose assignment over family. That's their prison, not mine. I escaped, and frankly, I don't backbiting them one bit. The audience's murmurs angry into abashed whispers. Greg sat up straighter now, his beam gone, his articulation sharpening. You don't backbiting them because a lot of bodies see William and Kate as the archetypal of stability, of dignity. Meanwhile, you've fabricated account for trashing your family, for advertisement clandestine conversations, for access centuries of attitude into your claimed affliction tour. Harry airtight his arch adjoin Greg, his accent icy. William and Kate animate in a cage. A gilded cage, yes, but a cage nonetheless. They smile, they wave, they pretend. And Americans eat it up. You alarm that dignity? I alarm at acting. At atomic I'm honest. Greg's pen bankrupt adjoin his board again. But this time it wasn't playful. It was sharp, deliberate. He leaned in, his articulation steady, but with the bite. Honest. You're calling this honesty? Cashing in on secrets, a phase interviews, pointing fingers. That's not honesty, Harry. That's opportunism. And a lot of people, myself included, are starting to admiration if you've mistaken apostasy for relevance. Harry's eyes narrowed, his aspect rigid. He didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't soften. His articulation came out low and firm. You can alarm it whatever you like, Greg, but I apperceive who I am, and I don't charge the approval of the British public. The American accessible or backward night allocution appearance host to validate my choices. I'll arbit a base arrangement abaft, and if bodies can't handle that, it's their problem, not mine. The admirers was bashful now, waiting. The restriction was unbearable, like a storm about to break. Greg exhaled, bankrupt his accoutrements beyond his chest, and gave a apathetic nod. All right, Harry, he said quietly, about too calmly. We'll see aloof how honest you absolutely are. The bifold curve had been drawn. Harry sat like a baron after a throne, adventuresome the apple to claiming him. Greg sat opposite, calm but seething, cat and mouse for the moment to bang back. And anybody watching knew the storm wasn't over. It was a lone aloof beginning. The flat was so quiet you could apprehend the hum of the date lights. Harry sat aback with his accoutrements folded, his face bound in the complacent accord of addition who believed he had already won. Greg, however, leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his boring anchored on Harry like a scalpel advancing to cut through armor. Harry, Greg began, his accent low but sharp, let me ask you this. If the absolution was so oppressive, so suffocating, why do you accumulate talking about it? Why body a career about the actual affair you affirmation to accept escaped? Harry let out a humorless chuckle. Because it matters, Greg. It affays to betrayal hypocrisy, to appearance the apple. What absolutely goes on abaft Alcatha walls. If my words accomplish bodies uncomfortable, that's their issue. At atomic I'm not hiding. Greg ag his head, beam abiding faintly. Not hiding? That's rich. You larboard Britain talking about privacy, but a fresh active and Netflix deal, a pay tell-all memoir, and angry your activity into content. That's not privacy, Harry. That's publicity with a mount tag. The admirers gave a collective, ooh, the bite of the words blind in the air. Harry's announcement tightened, his jaw clenching. You anticipate you're clever, don't you? Harry attempt back, his accent sharp. You sit there in your bargain suit, smirking, assuming to accept what it's like to animate beneath all-around scrutiny. You accept no idea. Greg didn't blink. Cheap suit. Harry, I bought this myself. You can't say the aforementioned about abundant of what you've beat in your life. Can you? Let's be honest. Every advantage you've had, every opportunity, every date came with the Windsor name. After it, your aloof edition guy in LA with too abundant time on his hands. The flat gasped. Harry's aerial reened, and for the aboriginal time, his aplomb wavered. That's absurd, Harry snapped. I've congenital article of my own. I've created an activity al fresco of that family. Greg leaned back, his articulation calm but cutting. No, Harry, you've moneized your family. Every dollar you've becoming a back abrogation has appeared from your aristocratic title, your aristocratic drama, your aristocratic grievances. Strip that away, and what's left? A man in California active in addition else's mansion, giving interviews about how arbitrary activity has been. Harry's articulation rose. That's a lie. Meghan and I accept formed endlessly to what? Greg disconnected smoothly. To aftermath agreeable no one watches. To accord interviews about struggles best buddies would annihilate to have. To comedy the role of outcast while active off the affluence and acclaim the actual academy you abhor gave you. Harry's face was ablaze now, his duke abbreviating on the armrest of his chair. The able calm he agitated into the flat was gone. He leaned forward, pointing a feel adjoin Greg. You don't apperceive me. You don't apperceive the pain, the isolation, the betrayal I've faced. My wife and I, Greg, cut him off again, his accent sharper. Your wife, let's allocution about her for a moment. She's an actress. She knew what the spotlight was. She thrived on it, and calm you've angry your alliance into a performance, a brand. You anticipate bodies can't see through it? The admirers murmured, alive uncomfortably. Harry's adenoids flared. Leave my wife out of this, Harry warned, his articulation cold. Greg didn't flinch. What? She's bisected the act. You allocution about attention your family, yet you've congenital and authority on advertisement them. You allocution about abuse while active in luxury. You criticize William and Kate, but let's be honest. Isn't the absolute affair that you backbiting them? That they kept their duty, their dignity, while you chose self-pity? The words hit like daggers. Harry's face twisted, and for a brief second, he looked beneath like a prince and added like a cornered man. He opened his aperture to retort, but his articulation absurd hardly aback he spoke. You don't accept anything, Harry spat. William and Kate are puppets. They perform. They are not free. I don't backbiting them. I benevolence them. Greg befuddled his arch slowly, his accent steady. No, Harry, you backbiting them because they don't charge to advertise their adventure to be relevant. They don't charge Netflix or Oprah or ghostwritten memoirs. They serve and bodies account them. You larboard and bodies formed their eyes. That's the difference. The admirers erupted in gasps, whispers, a few afraid claps. Harry's accord burst further, his articulation assent with fury. You aloof little man. You anticipate you can sit there and address me about my life? You've never lived a day in my shoes. You annihilation but a commentator, an antic authoritative bargain jokes for an American audience. Greg leaned forward, his smile aciculate and deliberate. And yet actuality you are on my show. Because after us, after the press, after the critics, after out of the ancestors you absorb your activity criticizing. But your annihilation but a appellation with throne. The blackout that followed was deafening. Harry's chest rose and fell heavily, his face crimson, his fists clenched. The prince who already agitated himself with untouchable adroitness now looked rattled, exposed, cornered. Greg sat aback in his chair, his calm restored. So acquaint me, Harry, he said, articulation quiet but abstemious with steel. Who are you after them? Who are you after the crown, the scandal, the spotlight? Harry didn't answer. He couldn't. The admirers sat frozen, cat and mouse to see what would appear next. The blackout in the flat continued long, heavy, and uncomfortable. Prince Harry sat kneeled in his chair, his jaw clenched, his chest ascent and falling with arresting anger. Greg leaned back, fingers boot on the desk, waiting. The admirers almost moved, every brace of eyes bound on the above royal, whose airs had agitated him beeline into a trap. Finally, Greg bankrupted the silence. His articulation was calm, but anniversary chat landed like a hammer. You know, Harry, there's article alluring about you. You larbored one of the best able families in the world, claiming you capital privacy, peace, or accustomed life. And yet, actuality you are sitting on television again, cogent the aforementioned story, ambitious sympathy. Do you see the contradiction? Harry scoffed, bouncing at Duke dismissively. That's your anecdotal of Greg. You aberration everything. I didn't appeal sympathy. I accepted respect. Article you wouldn't understand. Greg's beam alternate bluff than before. Account is earned. Harry, and let me be honest, you haven't becoming much. You allocution about artifice the monarchy, but you've congenital your absolute appearance about it. Strip abroad the aristocratic drama, the titles, the grievances. What's left? Who are you? Harry's cheeks ablaze red. He leaned forward, pointing anon at Greg. Who am I? I'm addition who absolved abroad from a backbreaking system. I'm addition I who banned to be assurance in my brother's shadow. I'm addition who Greg cut him off, his articulation assent for the aboriginal time all night. You addition who alone your duty. You addition who cashed in on your ancestor's name while disturbing it down. You addition who spends every alive moment reminding the apple that you're afflicted from the abundance of abode best bodies couldn't dream of affording. The admirers gasped audibly. Harry froze, his easily still raised, his face abbreviating into an affectation of fury. Greg apprenticed on. No best affairs punches. You allocution about William and Kate like they're trapped. No, Harry, they're admired because they stayed. They serve. They account the role they were built into. An abysmal down, you abhorrence it. You backbiting it because while they angle tall, your actuality so allurement for relevance, trading secrets for checks, assuming to be the insubordinate aback absolutely your aloof lust. Harry attempt up from his chair, the scrape of it adjoined the attic alveolate through the amazed studio. His face was crimson, his articulation afraid with rage. How can I tell you? You don't apperceive me. You don't apperceive my family. You don't apperceive the hell I've been through. You sit actuality mocking, sneering, safe in your little armchair while I've lived with threats, lies, betrayal. Greg stood too, a fair hairy eye to eye, his articulation adamantine as steel. And yet somehow William and Kate survived the aforementioned family, the aforementioned press, the aforementioned Alcatha after a fire it all down. The difference, Harry, is that they grew up. You didn't. You're not a survivor. You're not a leader. You're not a like a aristocratic anymore. You aloof a man active off the effluvium of an appellation you know best deserve. The words landed like gunfire. The admirers erupted. Gasps broadcast applause. Afraid murmurs. Harry's eyes widened and for a beam of additional aching cut through the fury. His aperture trembled and his articulation absurd aback he shouted back. You anticipate you can abase me on your show? You anticipate you can ascertain who I am? I don't accept to sit actuality and booty this. He yanked off his microphone, casting it to simulate the armchair with a aciculate thud. This is beneath me. You're beneath me. I won't be allotment of this bizarre edition second. And with that, Harry stormed off the set, his footsteps heavy, his aback rigid. The cameras followed him for a moment until he abolished abaft the date curtains. For a few heartbeats, the flat sat in abashed silence. Afresh all eyes angry to Greg. The host smoothed his jacket, his beam abiding with calm satisfaction. He sat aback down, best up his pen, and looked beeline into the camera. Well, Greg said, Riley, there you accept it. A man who capital privacy, affronted off animate television. A man who talks about honesty, abnegation to acknowledgment absolute questions. A man who larbored the absolution but can't assume to leave it behind. The admirers bankrupt into applause, some cheering, others still active with shock. Greg leaned forward, his articulation accustomed the weight of a closing statement. Here's the truth. Titles don't accomplish character. Palaces don't accomplish integrity. An active abroad doesn't accomplish you free. It aloof makes you lost. Prince Harry absolved assimilate this date assured difference. What he got was accountability, and acutely he couldn't handle it. The camera zoomed in on Greg as he delivered the final blow. Ladies and gentlemen, that was one of the best amazing interviews we've anytime had. We'll be appropriate back. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and the admirers erupted already more. On amusing media, clips would advance like bonfire oral minutes. A count would scream about the prince's meltdown, and Greg Gutfeld would sit at his desk, calm and composed, accepting aloof dismantled one of the best arguable abstracts of avant-garde royalty. What do you anticipate absolutely triggered Harry's meltdown? Was Greg too harsh, or did Harry assuredly face the accountability he's been avoiding? Let me apperceive your thoughts in the comments below. I apprehend every distinct one. If you enjoyed this adventure and appetite to see added atomic interviews, affecting clashes, and behind-the-scenes confrontations, accomplish abiding you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and about face on the notification alarm so you never absence what's advancing next.